Humans have always traveled. Seriously. We've been doing it since before our species was actually human. In Neolithic times, early humans migrated from North Africa to Europe. The demand for resources, weather, war, and trade have driven human movement for thousands of years. Okay, so my point here is that we've been traveling for a very long time. But the way in which we travel has changed significantly, and it continues to. When I chat with my own parents about their travels, there are distinct differences between how they traveled and how I travel now. My mom and dad traveled in the 80s. Mom has told me stories about writing handwritten letters and mailing them home to Canada from the Philippines, Thailand, and India. She and her travel buddy wrote home once every 3 to 4 weeks, one handwritten letter. Whenever they could, they would call home, always alternating between parents. They'd have a chat, and then that parent would call the other set of parents to let them know that both my mom and her buddy were safe. Things today are pretty different. When I spent 8 months in Asia, I was able to video call my family regularly, and I would talk with them over WhatsApp, sharing pictures every single day. With our mobile devices and Wi-Fi, I'd argue that travel today is much easier. Transport is better, we have information at our fingertips, and we can communicate home 24/7. Before we get started, I have to quickly shout out to my mom because this episode was her idea. She literally pitched it to me, citing that it'd be nice to hear some more diverse people on the podcast. So Mom, this one's for you. Okay, so that was a long intro, and I promise I'm done rambling. Alpaca pals, today I'm chatting with Velika. Did I say it wrong? I did. And she's going to share with us her experiences as a traveler in the 1960s. Welcome, Velika.
Thank you very much. Actually, my travels started as early as the 60s only because my parents, who were immigrants, decided that since they couldn't go back and visit their families, especially because they were in communist countries at the time, that they would just throw their 13-year-old daughter on a plane and loaded me down with as much baggage as was allowed for a single person, and I wore 3 layers of clothing with the instructions that take this home to the family, leave everything there, come back with empty bags. You're going to your godmother's, you're flying to Vienna, and then you're going to take a bus and it'll drop you off in this square at 5:30 in the morning, and your godmother has your photograph and she'll pick you up. So that was my first experience traveling.
Were you afraid?
Actually, I really wasn't. I was an only child, and I'd been brought up with adults, and I think it kind of makes you more independent. A lot of their friends were shocked that they were doing this. I think personally they were just looking for 6 weeks of childless bliss.
Just ship her off to Europe.
Absolutely, So off I went, and it turned out beautifully. I had a wonderful time there. I picked up the language in 6 weeks. It was great. The language, became second nature. It was Hungarian. Oh. Hungarian. So I traveled to Budapest and spent 6 weeks there with relatives, with 2 different aunts. One was my godmother and another one. So one was on my father's side, one was on my mother's side. And they took me around. Budapest is filled with spas from the Turks who ruled over Hungary. And they took me swimming every day. It was a different pool. It was, so for a 13-year-old, it was fabulous.
Yeah.
But that was my first experience alone, and I didn't find it daunting at all.
Can I ask what the plane was like? Because I hear that in the 60s, planes were really different. Planes
were large. They were not full, so you could actually be sitting in a seat and be able to lie down. There would be so many empty seats, you could just flip the armrests and actually lie down because they weren't as strict on seat belting. Well, even now, I mean, during the flight, you can take the seat belt off. But you could actually lie down and sleep. But they did smoke. But it was flying then was more of a luxury because it wasn't overused.
Yeah.
So it was luxurious for everyone, not just the business class.
I've read that people drank a lot on the planes.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
that people would land and just be sloshed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it.
And what was it like going through airports at that time? Because there wasn't security like there is now.
No, there wasn't. And actually, when I was 13 and went through the Vienna airport, what my parents didn't foresee was the fact that the airports didn't have like full 24-hour staffing. They didn't have those little push carts to carry your luggage because we weren't globalized. It just wasn't, there wasn't a need for it. So when I arrived there at midnight and I had to catch this bus, which was on the other side of the airport, I had to lug all that luggage that they packed with me as fast as my little feet could carry me all the way through the airport to get this bus. So that was probably the worst part of the trip.
Yeah.
Other than that, everything went fine. But it was interesting because there was very little, if any, security. There was, like I said, no staff, no help with your luggage. And it didn't matter that I was 13. I was on my own.
I was going to
Me
say,
and my
no
bags.
one questioned this.
No one questioned.
Because nowadays, people would definitely take notice if there was a 13-year-old.
Well, I was, mature-looking 13-year-old, but nonetheless, I mean, they had to have known I was a teenager.
Yeah.
But still, I was lugging all that stuff.
And you had never met this family before?
Never.
Oh, wow.
Never. So that it was. I wasn't afraid of those kinds of things. And my parents, it's funny, they had these weird, for European parents, they had these weird mentalities. Like it wasn't okay to visit a boy's house, even if there was supervision there, but it was okay to send your kid across the world. Just different ways of thinking,
Yeah.
But that's what started my interest. And of course, once I went back, my parents decided to go back. Like we went as a family when I was 15. So that would have been 50 years ago. So we went when I was 15. I don't know what era that was. This in late 60s still, I think. 69, yes.
Was it, were you culturally shocked at all?
Not going to Hungary. Like I enjoyed Hungary. It was very different. It was more slow-paced, and I noticed that people really took time to enjoy their lives. But I find the same today, to be honest.
Oh, totally.
It hasn't changed very much.
And I also imagine, because similarly, when I wasn't 13, but when I was 16, my parents sent me to family in the Netherlands. And I remember feeling an odd sense of familiarity because a lot of the food and the language, all of it was familiar to me because I'd grown up in a household where Mom spoke Dutch and she fed us Dutch food. And so it didn't feel that strange to me to be in another culture because it was like a familiar culture to me.
Likewise.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, Hungary was one of the not least affected by communism, but it was, out of all the countries that were under communist regime, it was one of the more forward countries. They seemed to have more abilities to work and thrive than some of the other countries under communist regimes. So I didn't really notice anything politically oppressive when I was in Hungary. And I was a child. I probably wasn't really looking for it, but I had no sense of it at that point. But when I was 15 and I went back with them, well, my parents decided, we're going to travel all through Europe. on our way to Hungary, and we were also going to Russia because my father is from the Ukraine. His parents are from Hungarian background, but the borders there have changed so many times. So I got a taste of what their traveling looked like and decided that it was never going to be my kind of traveling, because their traveling was like zip, 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 zip all through these, different countries. Been there, done that, saw this, like went to Rome, saw the Colosseum, went to Pompeii, saw Pompeii, but that's all they did. They'd go and see like one of the big monuments, and then they'd been there. And I thought, so I mean, it was like a whirlwind to me. I only have moments of memory, like some things that really stood out for me. But otherwise, it was just a whirlwind until we actually got to Hungary and stopped. But what was very, when you ask culturally shocking, when we did go into communist Russia, like the USSR back in 1969, 1971, crossing the border and this is from one communist country into Russia, right? Crossing the border, they tore our car apart. Like literally, they took the doors off, took them apart. They had machine guns right at the border. Like I'd never seen a gun, let alone a machine gun. It was absolutely overwhelming to see that kind of power at the border. It was overwhelming. And to actually feel the part of I began to really feel what it was like not to have freedom, because we take freedom so much for granted, and all of a sudden it was like, okay, unless you know what freedom, like the lack of freedom is, you don't really know how to appreciate freedom. And here I was actually witness to a country that my relatives lived there, and yet they were never allowed to leave the country. They couldn't say, oh, well, let's go visit our relatives over in Canada. Like, there was no such thing. Wouldn't it be nice to go visit Italy? No, you couldn't do that. There was no such thing. You could only travel within the USSR. I learned many limitations that they lived under. And so I was only 15 at the time, but it was pretty shattering to realize what, and again, the oppression of the politics was so evident everywhere. As a 15-year-old, I'd walk around, with my little Russian pretend accent, using Lenin's name, and my relatives were like freaking out because this was a very real fear to them. Like they could have been scooped off the street. I could have been scooped off the street. Mm-hmm. When we got to the town where my father's relatives lived, he was born about 10 kilometers outside of the city. They would not let us go to the city, not even for a visit. Like to the not the city. They would not let us go to it was a village, actually. They would not let us drive to the village to see his family home. We had to stay in the hotel, and his family all had to come in to see us. We were not allowed to go have a family meal out there. That's how controlled it was. And we were watched. And if we broke that rule, because we figured, well, it'd be easy enough to sneak into a car. But the thing is, if you broke that rule, you'd be told that you could never go back. Of course, none of us wanted to take that chance, right? Yeah. So it was that was quite, when we talk about cultural differences, that was quite a cultural difference. And now, even with my kids, we talk about freedom, and I say we toss around the word freedom so easily, but
totally.
I still say unless you know what it's like to live without it, you really don't appreciate what it is to have it.
It really speaks to privilege, which is something we talk about pretty frequently on this podcast. And this concept of, like, at that time, Russians not being able to leave resonates with me because when I lived in the Netherlands, I had a friend who was Russian, still have a friend. Her name's Adele. Hi, Adele. I know you listen. And we loved to travel together, go on little trips like all around Europe. And I remember at one point we wanted to go to the UK and we couldn't go because she was unable to get granted a visa to go because she held a Russian passport. And that was the first time I really thought about passport privilege and how lucky I am to hold a Canadian passport, because I think it's something like 160 countries we can enter on arrival, like no advance visa. Yeah. And that is such a rare thing on this planet. So many people have to jump through so many hoops just to go on a vacation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So
that was
interesting you bring that up.
So that was my experience. I had 2 summers where I traveled with my parents on these whirlwind European vacays. And, ending up with family, which was always, a great celebratory thing. But it was then that I decided I wanted to go back and see some of the places that they kind of whisked me through too quickly. And so when I was 19, I decided to go back. So whatever year that would have been. 69, 71,
somewhere
73,
in the
73. Okay. So I worked all summer and worked through the winter so that I could afford to go. And I wasn't backpacking. I mean, backpacking wasn't really a thing then.
Yeah.
It was suitcasing. But, I mean, I loved going alone. To me, being alone forced me to be more outgoing, forced me to meet people. And my whole thing about traveling was that I wanted to, it wasn't even about the scenery, like about the places or the monuments as much as it was to get the feel of the local life and just to walk around in it. And even in Paris, if didn't matter that I couldn't speak French, I could still go to a cafe and I could people watch. And, a few times people sat down and we were able to converse, with a piece of paper and pencil, or sometimes they spoke English. So it just was, that was my thing. I liked to just get the feel of the countries. So when I planned that trip, of course, I was going to go visit family as well. So I was going through all the paperwork and red tape of getting into Russia again. And I decided, if I'm like, the part of Russia I was entering is very close to the Hungarian border. But I thought if I have to go through all this red tape, I may as well spend a few extra $100 and go see what was then Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev and Lvov. And I mean, I didn't speak any Russian, and I certainly knew that up that end they didn't speak any Hungarian. So I was going into very cold waters, so to speak. And they built my itinerary. I couldn't say I want to spend more time in Leningrad. I mean, all I could say is I want to spend more time in Uzhgorod, which is where my father was from. But they said, okay, you've got 3 days in Leningrad. They drop you off at the hotel. Nobody on the plane that you were with ahead of time gets dropped to the same hotel. They all get dropped to different hotels. It's wild.
Huh. And so they were monitoring you, clearly. Oh, they knew where you were at all times. Okay.
Always. It was always.
Did they give you, my mom told me, because she traveled through China when it was really communist, and she said that she was given not like fake money, essentially, that she wasn't allowed to use actual Chinese money. It had to be like tourist designated money. And she was saying this was how they monitored where they were going and what they were spending money on.
Isn't that interesting? No. No, because I remember using rubles there.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I was using their money. But I knew that I was, at any time, I could be being, I could have been watched. So, but I mean, I wasn't concerned about it because I was, pretty boring, all things considered. But, I got to go see I loved Leningrad or St. Petersburg. I got to go see the winter palaces, the summer palaces. So that kind of history really interested me a lot. It was just a beautiful place. Leningrad was like they had a lot of canals, much like Venice. They live on a system of canals. But it was very gray, and the people were gray, and their clothing was gray. And yet, I could go to the opera or the ballet for next to nothing in terms of cash money. Like, all their people could go to enjoy the arts. It wasn't a lot of money for anyone. The average Russian could go and see these beautiful things. So, the streets and the people and the clothing were gray, gray, gray. And then you'd go into this, the opera house, which was like opulent and with chandeliers and lights and marble and, and the beauty of the show. It would be like one extreme to the next. But so I got to enjoy the beauty they had to offer, but it was very interesting to put it together with the people. The people were very kind, and when I got to Moscow, there you could really feel political oppression, like it was in the air all the time. But I went to, I would just go to different coffee houses, and I remember one afternoon running into this young man, and we ended up having coffee, and we ended up sitting there for like 4 hours having this complete conversation just on a piece of paper. But it was lovely. And to me, that's what traveling was all about back then. Again, was I able to call my parents? No. There really wasn't anyway.
Yeah, were they concerned for you at all? I mean, especially in that time, I'm sure, even when I was traveling alone as a woman, which I did for a long time before I met my partner, I would just get so many comments from people, not just my parents, friends and colleagues, questioning whether it was safe and why would I want to do that? Why would I put myself at risk? So I imagine at that time, there was probably quite a taboo against it.
Well, not so much.
Interesting.
Not so much. We didn't have the worries and concerns that we have now about traveling. Like now we've got a whole list of places that are unsafe to go to. Mm. There was no such list back then. Right. Traveling was considered more of an experience than... Are you going alone? Like it wasn't built on tours. Mm. Do you know what I mean? It was more of a more, not necessarily a solo thing, but it wasn't built on groups. Yeah. So being a woman, being a man, traveling alone, I never found that it made that much of a difference. I think it all depended really on what your personal comfort level was. Mm-hmm. If you were comfortable going into that position. Mm-hmm. Now, personally me, I'll tell you, when I got off the plane in Leningrad, I'd been on the plane for the last very long trip, the last 10, 12 hours with people that spoke no English. So not the pilot, not the stewardess, not a single passenger on the plane, nothing. And I finally got into my hotel, and I dumped my bags, and as tired as I went down to the bar, ordered myself a drink, and out loud in the middle of the bar said, "Does anyone speak English?" So clearly I was not a shy person.
I get it, though, because I've had that, especially when I traveled alone. When you're surrounded by a foreign language all the time, I would get into moments of desperation where I would do similar things, like seek out someone who could speak English because I was so depraved of conversation.
Exactly. And I remember this gentleman, like older gentleman, like by then he was in his 30s or 40s, but older for me. I was 19. He came over. He was from England, and he was there on business. And he sat down with me and, chatted. And I just kind of went, blah, 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 blah. All this stuff came out. I just spent 12 hours on this plane, blah, 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 blah. He very patiently listened to me. And then he very nicely, gave me some ideas as to where I should go and what I should, ask to go see. And so he was very helpful. He was leaving the next morning, so that was the end of my help there. But it was nice to have that connection, and that's how I got to take my next step forward. You reach out, you meet someone that you can communicate with, they give you your next step forward. And that's kind of how it went. You had to force yourself onto people to create your next step forward. What did they recommend? And then following up on that recommendation. And so that's what made it such an experience.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you say that, because I've heard some people say that travel now can be more lonely because we're not required to connect anymore to be able to travel. You can travel alone and completely rely on your phone the entire time without ever having to ask someone for a helping hand. And I think it's probably detrimental to the kind of human connection that people, especially during that time, probably felt as travelers.
I think so too, because how approachable are you, even to to a foreigner in another country? How approachable are you if you're sitting on a phone?
Mm-hmm.
Not so much.
Mm-hmm. I was telling you before we started recording, I started backpacking at around 19, and at that time, mobile phones weren't super prominent yet. So some people had them, but for the most part, no. And I stayed in hostels, and I remember specifically in Italy loving the culture of hostels, because a room full of 30 strangers, and everyone would sit down and eat dinner together, laughing. We'd go out drinking. We would just all connect. And I really loved just talking to people from different countries and learning about what their life was like. And I would build these friendships with people that I'm still in contact with. But now when I go into hostels, everyone's just on their phone or on their laptop or Skyping with someone. And it's
And see, I kind of missed out on the hostel thing. It wasn't really a thing back then yet.
Not yet, yeah.
Where you stayed kind of depended on who you knew.
Mm.
When I went to Paris, I could go back to Paris. And I was lucky. Interesting story. I was lucky because my father had an aunt who was a nun and lived in a nunnery there. And so she knew I was coming, and it was when I'd been there with my parents, they were in the old original convent, this big stone building. But by the time I got there at 19, they were now in a little low-rise apartment. So I was given a little room with a balcony overlooking the garden, a key, and just told that I need to be inside the gates before midnight. And of course, I was 19, and back then, we weren't looking for parties.
Yeah.
It was a different era. We weren't looking to go out. Traveling wasn't about partying and drinking. I mean, we drank, but that was the nature of in my case, that was the nature of Hungarians and Russians. We drank. But I wasn't into partying, so I was always home well before midnight. But it was interesting that, I was staying at a convent and, prancing around Paris. And whenever I was in Paris, I always would I had a Eurail pass. And every time I went back, I would take the night train to Venice, because I always knew that there's no way that I could afford to spend a night in Venice. but there was no way that I wanted to miss a day in Venice. So I used to take the night train from Paris to Venice, and it would let me off at dawn. I would spend the entire day in Venice, scouting out the little shops around St. Mark's Square and just enjoying the day and the pigeons and, being in Venice and seeing the water and standing on a bridge and watching the gondola go past me underneath, because I couldn't afford those experiences, but just being that close allowed me to feel a little bit of it. So I would always do that one day to Venice and then take the night train back again, and I'd be in Paris again. And then I remember when I was going to England, I was giving myself 3 weeks in London, but I didn't know anyone in London that I could stay with. So this was my first, kind of glitch, because I thought, well, okay, we're going to sit on this train and we're going to get to London, and then I'm going to have to get on the phone and try and find a room or someplace to stay. So it was like way up in the air, like completely not planned. And like no internet, nothing like that, right? And so, this was a funny story, because I got on the train, and all of a sudden this young guy gets on the train. Turns out he's from Belleville.
No.
Yeah. And his name is Mike, and he gets on the train, and I see that he has a Canadian passport, and I went, oh, thank God. Thank God. Someone who speaks English, thank you. So we start chatting right away, and then all of a sudden this young woman gets on, and she's got a Hungarian passport. And I think, what are the odds of that? And her name was Judith, right? So I start talking to her in Hungarian. We're talking back and forth in Hungarian, and Mike's sitting there, and then I talk to Mike in English. And then somehow we find out that Judith and Mike both speak French. So here we're able to converse, but only two at a time. Like Mike and I can speak in English, Judith and Mike can speak in French, and Judith and I can speak in Hungarian. And that was our train ride. It was our train ride to London. And then Judith had a place, had a place to go, but we decided to hook up, all of us, because this was the year that, you love this. This was the opening day of two movies, The Exorcist,
a classic,
and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Can you imagine those two movies coming out on the same day? Like, give me a break. Like, honestly. And of course, we had to see both of them. So we made that plan.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I still didn't know, Mike saying, where are you going? I said, I don't know. I said, I'm going to have to get on the phone, get a newspaper, figure it out. But I'll figure it out and I'll be at the movies, right? So we decided to go see a midnight show of one and the early morning show of the other. So he says, why don't you come back with me? He had relatives there. He says, come back with me. He says, at least you can use the phone there and, it'll be easier for you. And I said, okay. And while I'm there, like, his relatives make a call to some neighbor, and it turns out this neighbor is runs a rooming house and rents out rooms by the month or whatever. And she happened to have a room that was open, and she agreed to rent it to me for 3 weeks.
Oh, beautiful.
Like, talk about falling into, and so what better way to live in London for 3 weeks than to rent a little room. So there were only certain times you could use the bathtub.
Yeah.
And there were, the bathroom was like outside of your room, but in my room they had everything. They had a hot plate that I could cook on, and dishes and bedding. Everything came with the room.
Good to go.
It was great. So there I stayed, and we went and saw our movies, and then Judith went off to wherever Judith went off to. I don't remember, but Mike and I, and Mike was able to get his relatives to score another bike. So he had a bicycle to use, and then he got one for me. And then our job every day became, okay, let's hit an open market, buy some wine, buy some bread, buy some cheese and some fruit, and let's find a new park every day to go and picnic in. And that's what we did.
Amazing.
And that's what we did. And it was wonderful. And actually, Mike and I stayed in touch for quite a time after that. Like when I came back and went to university, he used to come and visit me in London when I was at university.
No way.
Yeah, so we stayed in touch for a few years.
Awesome.
And so that was kind of a fun little occurrence, the way the events all kind of fell into place there.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun.
A couple years ago, I think Cuba is probably the only place in the world where you still have to be resourceful because there's no Wi-Fi, there's no internet access in most places, and it's very community-oriented. So your story makes me giggle because I remember one day doing the same thing. My friend and I hopped in a shared cab to this random town and arrived there and had nowhere to stay. And there you stay in homestays, so you stay with families in a little room in their house. And so we had no choice. We just had to start knocking on doors. And so we knock on this door, and this Cuban woman comes out, and we're trying to explain to her, we need somewhere to sleep. Same thing, like trying to write to her with our little bit of Spanish. And then she tells us, oh, no, I'm sorry, my room is full. But then she calls her husband, and her husband comes out onto the road and starts walking down the street just yelling. And all the neighbors are coming out. And finally, he comes back like 20 minutes later, and he's like, I found a place. And he has us follow him through the town. And finally, we arrive at this house, and this woman has a room available. And it was just you have to be so resourceful and figure it out. And it's almost more fun that way.
Yeah, no, I've been to Cuba. I've seen that kind of resourcefulness. It is very cool. Yeah. And it is very interesting how they'll all just rent out their rooms, these homestays. It's great. It's a great way for them to make money too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Works out great.
Yeah. And we got kind of really into the just like no plans whatsoever. We'll just find a car to drive us, and we'll find a place to stay, and we'll find somewhere to eat. We'll figure it out. I don't mind that though. I don't mind that at all. 2 years ago, I went back to Hungary after 27 years. Wow. How was it different? Did you find it different?
It was different in the sense that they're eating a lot healthier than they used to.
When I was there, I was like, I can't eat meat anymore. It was all meat.
Well, it is all meat, but the thing is, it's not as much fried meat as it used to be. Everything used to be fried. But you're right. They were not a very they've never been a very vegetable oriented
eating culture.
No. But what I noticed is in restaurants, like one of the main things in every Hungarian restaurant would have been like Wiener Schnitzel, like most of them don't have it. They have goulash. But so things have changed that way. But the city is the same. Like they have a rule there that nothing can be built higher than the steeple of the Parliament buildings. So in that sense, when you look at this outlay of the city, when you stand, on a hill overlooking the Danube, it looks very much the same. You don't have all the modern skylines that you have in other cities because they won't allow it, right? And it's kind of nice. Like they really honor the old. So that was a nice thing. But, even when I was away in Europe, I didn't find that I didn't call my kids that often. I figured I got used to traveling. It was like when I'm traveling and it's my time.
Yeah.
And that's that. So I didn't find that I called once in a while to touch base, yes, I called, but it wasn't like a daily thing. It was my time So, I mean, I loved being there with my relatives, and it turned out that the Stones were playing again. I was traveling alone, so I said, well, if I'm going to, where can I get a ticket? I happened to get one in Berlin, so I flew to Berlin for 4 days just so I could see the Stones, and I was very surprised at how very efficient their public transportation was. I was able to zip around there, easy peasy.
Yeah.
So I didn't find there either I needed to use my phone that much.
Yeah.
So you don't have to rely on that technology.
That's very true.
And I think the fact that I never did in the past means that I'm less likely to do so.
I understand, though, because I think because my partner and I, we both were sort of at the tail end of the period in which technology really kicked in for travel, that we still appreciate just wandering and like seeing what happens. So we're pretty carefree in that department, I must say. And I really love that. And I think that it makes us both much better navigators in general because we have been forced to develop the skills that you need to be able to navigate without the crutch of technology. So,
and I think that's the thing, that if you've started off without it, you don't rely on it. But if you've only traveled with it, it's hard to
remove that.
Yeah.
And I think people get a little obsessed with needing to know. I think like a lot of people nowadays when it comes to travel, they have a need to control, know where they are, know where they're going, what's the itinerary for the day. And I think like that's just because the travel industry has boomed and now it's all about like commercialized experiences. But I find that a lot of travelers have trouble letting go of that obsession with like controlling what their day will look like.
Or sometimes it's just what is their own comfort level, you know?
Yeah. Okay, I have some final questions.
Okay.
Tell us something you learned on your travels.
Oh, there's so much I don't know where to begin. It definitely taught me to be more open-minded, to, more accepting, more tolerant. Definitely taught me to be more independent. I think I already was, but it definitely made me stronger that way. And just the love of learning, like learning about new people, new cultures. And that's really important because I later on in life became a teacher. And so especially when I was teaching subjects like social studies or even history, which is really not as boring as most people think. It's really the study of people. Yeah. I took the experiences from my own life of travel and tried to instill some of those experiences into my students, like just examining different cultures and why they do things the way they do. Because there's always, there's reasons for it. It's like either location or resources or, we all do things differently, but we do them because there are reasons for them. And so it's important not to judge how people do it because how people do something because we all do it for different reasons, right? Mm-hmm. So just an open-mindedness that way, I learned.
Yeah. And tell us about, I was thinking it'd be fun for you to tell us about a person that you met that's really memorable on your travels. We've heard about Mike already.
Hard to say. There are many people I've met who are relatives. There are many people, even relatives, like for example, 2 years ago when I went back to Hungary for the first time in many, many years, one of the most important things that I did plan was that I was going to be in my father's hometown in Russia on his birthday, which was June 4th. He's passed away, and I took ashes with me. I brought ashes with me, and I was going to bury them with his mother and father on his birthday in his hometown. And in doing that, I was also going to be connecting with a cousin of mine who was my father's namesake. Okay, same name. And so I was quite looking forward to meeting up with my cousin, and he was going to take me to the cemetery and everything. And so I thought I was just going to be meeting him, but he started writing to me that he, was really not feeling well. He was in the hospital. He's still weak, and that his daughter came home to take care of him, and that she might have to take me out to the cemetery because he was too weak. And as it turns out, I don't want to put a damper here, but again, there's always a reason things happen. I don't believe in coincidences, but unfortunately, literally the morning we were leaving to go to my father's hometown, my cousin's daughter contacted me and told me that my cousin had passed away. So literally, I go back to the hometown, and I had never met his wife or his two daughters, who were 20 and 21. So I'd never met them before. And here, their dad was now gone, and they took me to the cemetery, and I did what I had to do, and I ended up staying the night and being part of a village funeral. It happens very quickly, not like here. They don't do all the preservation and everything. They just bury. And I remember my father telling me, how they did it. They'd wheel the cart through the village, and all the villagers used to follow the cart with flowers. And so I remember my father telling me this story and me kind of reliving it, through, here's my father's namesake who passes on his birthday. It was just all very strange. But what it did, it just brought out so much compassion for his wife and his daughters that I realize now that I'm never going to be able to go back to Hungary without having to go back to my father's hometown and looking up these two girls, Dorothy and Carolyn, looking them up, because all of a sudden I never really knew them as family, but I got to know them at this time, and they grew very special to me.
Yeah.
But
we've got 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, 6 minutes left.
Okay, I'll say the conclusion.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, we're concluding now.
It's all good. It's all good. Keep it going.
Okay, now we're losing more time.
Go.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
oh, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Well, Alpaca My Bags is hosted by me, Erin Hines, and produced by Katie Lohr here in Toronto. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us on Instagram and on Twitter at alpacamybagspod. You can also reach us through our website, alpacamybags.ca. If you like what you're hearing, please tell a friend about our podcast. You can also share a screenshot of our podcast to your Insta story and maybe tag us, and then maybe we'll reshare it and it'll be fun. So please do that. Anyways, till next time, I hope you get to alpaca your bag soon. Bye.